They didn't hide this book because it was fiction. They hid it because it was a blueprint. Somewhere in the limestone caves above the Dead Sea, sealed inside clay jars so old the wax had fused with the stone itself, a text survived that the most powerful religious institution in human history spent centuries trying to erase. Not because it was dangerous to your faith, because it was dangerous to their power. The Book of Giants, discovered in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. Read by scholars. Classified. Quietly set aside. And the reason they set it aside, the real reason, is not what they told you. It wasn't about canon. It wasn't about consistency with accepted doctrine. It was because this text describes the Watchers, the fallen angels, not as simple villains consumed by lust. It describes them as engineers. Beings who brought something down from beyond the boundary of the known universe. Something that was never meant to exist on this earth. A technology. A capability. A code for rewriting life itself. And the Great Flood? That was not God's anger. That was a quarantine protocol. This is the story they deleted. This is the blueprint they buried. And this is why it matters right now. In the 4th century AD, a group of men sat down and made a decision that would define the next 2,000 years of human civilization. They were bishops, scholars, men of enormous influence inside a Roman Empire that had recently adopted Christianity as its official religion. And they were deciding which texts were sacred and which texts had to disappear. The criteria they used were not purely theological. They were political. A new empire needed a clean story. A clear hierarchy. A defined line between light and darkness. Between the divine and the demonic. Between what was permitted and what was forbidden. Ambiguity was the enemy. And the Book of Giants was ambiguous in the worst possible way. It had been circulating for centuries before the council met. Fragments of it had been read by early Jewish communities in Judea, by early Christian communities across North Africa. It traveled east into Persian religious tradition, further east still, into the communities of Central Asia. That kind of reach does not happen by accident. Stories travel that far only when they carry something people recognize as true, or something people recognize as dangerous, or both. The scholar Lorenz Duckenbrook, whose 1997 reconstruction of the Book of Giants remains the definitive academic work on the subject, described the text as preserving what he called an alternative tradition, a different version of the events that preceded the flood. Alternative. That single word contains everything. Because it means the story we were given, the clean story, the simple story of monsters destroyed and goodness preserved, was a choice. Not the only version. Not the original version. A version that was selected because it served a purpose. The version that was buried served a different purpose entirely. It told the truth about what the Watchers actually brought with them when they fell. Before we can understand what was buried, we need to understand what the world looked like before the flood. Not the world of Sunday school lessons. Not the simplified world of monsters and saints. The world as the oldest texts describe it. The Book of Enoch itself, a text that survived only because the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved it as canonical scripture when every other major tradition had abandoned it, describes the Watchers with a precision that feels less like mythology and more like a deposition. 200 divine beings. Specific ranks. Specific names. Specific transgressions. Barachiel, whose name means lightning of God. Azazel. Samyasa. Listed with the kind of detail you associate with a legal document rather than a legend. And their sin was not simply desire. Their sin was transmission. Enoch chapter 8. The Watchers taught humanity things that were not meant to be known. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war from metal. He taught the art of the sword. He taught the cutting of roots and working of plants for intoxication and control. Others taught the reading of the sky not for navigation, not for farming, but to manipulate natural forces. Others still taught something the text describes in terms so specific and so strange that scholars have debated its meaning for decades. The enchantments. The workings. The procedures that, when applied to living things, produced something new. Something that had never existed before. The Nephilim. We have been taught to think of them as simply large. Larger than men. Powerful. Violent. But the fragments of the Book of Giants suggest something more disturbing. They were not an accident. They were a result. The Watchers had accessed something, a knowledge, a capability, a code that existed above the boundary of what creation was designed to support. And they brought it down into the genome of humanity, into the biology of the world that was not built to contain it. What came out the other side was enormous, yes. But the fragments describe more than size. They describe a civilization. The Nephilim built. They organized. They created hierarchies. They established councils. They had leaders and deliberations and something that functioned like governance. That is not the behavior of animals. That is the behavior of an intelligence that had been engineered to exceed its environment. And for a time an indeterminate, terrible, magnificent time it worked. The ancient texts speak of their structures. Edifices that defy every engineering principle we can reconstruct for that era. Stone moved with a precision that modern machinery would struggle to replicate. Not because of magic. Because of applied knowledge. Because of the blueprint. But there is a cost to exceeding your environment. The environment itself begins to collapse. The natural world, according to the fragments, began to fail under the weight of what the Nephilim consumed and destroyed. Not as metaphor. As a documented sequence. Animals behaving wrongly. Seasons arriving out of order. Rivers refusing their banks. The living world sending signals that something had gone irreparably wrong. And the beings with the most power to respond, the ones whose choices had created the imbalance, were the last to receive the message. Because that is what power does. It insulates you from consequence just long enough for the consequence to become irreversible. Mahui, son of Barachiel, son of lightning, did not dream the way ordinary creatures dream. When the visions came for him, they came with the weight of revelation, the precision of a verdict, the coldness of a mechanism that does not know the word mercy because mercy is not part of its design. The first dream came in darkness. A garden. Lush, enormous, every living thing contained within it. Trees bearing fruit that pulsed with light. The accumulated richness of everything the earth had ever produced, gathered in one place and flourishing. Then the second image arrived. Not a storm. Not a war. Not the kind of destruction that comes with noise and fury and the dignity of being opposed. A wave. Black. Absolute. Silent. Coming not from the sea but from above. From the sky itself. As if the heavens had opened a valve and decided to empty everything they contained. And the wave did not destroy through violence. It erased. Maui watched the garden disappear. Not burning. Not collapsing. Simply ceasing. The trees, the fruit, the light gone as if they had never been written into existence in the first place. Then the stone tablet. Vast. Carved with thousands of names. Every creature. Every being. Every soul that had ever drawn breath on this earth. The wave reached the tablet and the names began to go dark, one by one, washed clean, smoothed over, until the stone was blank. Except for three names. Intact. Untouched. Standing alone on a surface that had once held the entire record of life. Maui woke up. And here's where the story diverges completely from every version of this mythology you have ever been told. The mightiest being alive, the inheritor of the forbidden blueprint, the commander of a civilization built on engineered power, did not respond with rage. He called a council. The fragments from the Qumran caves describe what happened next to something closer to a collapse than a meeting. The Nephilim, these massive, terrifying, constructed intelligences, gathered together and fell apart. They argued. They searched for interpretations that might soften what they had seen. They brought in every prophet and diviner and reader of signs that their civilization contained. None of them could offer comfort. Because the dream was not a symbol. A symbol requires interpretation. This required none. A wave that erases everything except three names is not a riddle. It is a sentence. Then Oha spoke. Another of the Nephilim leaders, a figure mentioned in the surviving fragments as one who had also dreamed that same night. His dream was simpler. A tree. Ancient. Rooted so deeply in stone that nothing alive should have been able to move it. A gardener came, not an army, not a god in glory, just a gardener, and without ceremony, without anger, with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a necessary task. He cut it down. That was all. No battle. No final confrontation. No dramatic last stand. Just the end. Oha had said nothing until Maui finished speaking.
He does not lie.
Then he said, quietly, I too dreamed. The council went completely silent. Because in the ancient world, in every tradition, in every culture that preserved these memories, one prophetic dream could be an event. Two prophetic dreams on the same night among the highest leaders of your civilization meant something else entirely. It meant the message was intentional. It meant someone had sent it deliberately. And they all knew, every being in that council knew who had sent it. What none of them could say out loud, what none of them could bring themselves to speak, was what it meant for them specifically. The blueprint they carried, the inherited code of the Watchers, had produced something the universe was not designed to sustain. And the mechanism that maintained universal order had identified the contamination and activated its response. Not in anger. Not in judgment in any human sense. In the way a biological system responds to a pathogen. Automatically. Completely. Without negotiation. The flood was not God losing his temper. The flood was a quarantine protocol. And it had already been initiated. Mahui made a decision that should not have been possible for a being of his design. He chose to ask rather than fight. Think carefully about what that means. The entire architecture of the Nephilim, their physical power, their inherited knowledge, their civilization built on the principle that strength creates its own authorization, everything in their design said, meet force with force. Meet threat with dominance. Meet the end with a final, catastrophic expenditure of everything you have. Mahui rejected it. He spread his wings enormous, dark, built for velocities that no natural creature could achieve, and he flew. Not toward a battlefield. Not toward the Watchers who had created him, who were themselves already imprisoned, already sealed away, already beyond reach. Toward the edge of the world. The fragments are damaged at this point. Torn. Burnt at the margins. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Mahui flew until the geography of the known world ran out. Until he passed the mountains that marked the boundary between the living and the domain of what lay beyond the living. Until he reached the place where, according to every ancient cosmology, the ordered world met the unordered void. And there he found Enoch. A mortal man. Not a giant. Not a divine being. Not even a prophet in the conventional sense. Just a man who had walked so closely with the source of all order that he had been taken, according to Genesis, straight into the presence of the divine without experiencing death. The most engineered, most powerful being on earth came to a human being and said, "Please tell me what it means." Let that settle. Because it ruptures every assumption embedded in the traditional story. The Book of Giants does not present Mahui as redeemed by this gesture. It does not suggest that the asking canceled the debt. What it presents is something more precise and more disturbing. Even a being constructed from forbidden knowledge, even an intelligence that had been assembled from a blueprint that should never have existed, retained, somewhere inside its architecture, the capacity to recognize that it had exceeded its authorization. The capacity to ask. Enoch listened. And then he answered. The three names on the stone tablet. The only names the wave left standing. They were Noah and his sons. Not the greatest builders. Not the most powerful beings. Not the inheritors of the forbidden blueprint. A man and his children who had, quietly and without glory, maintained their genetic integrity. who had not been altered by the Watcher's technology, who carried what the original design had specified. The wave was not metaphorical. It was a cleansing mechanism, and it had been calibrated with a precision that would preserve exactly what the original template required. The rest, the magnificent, terrible, engineered civilization of the Nephilim, the structures too massive for the tools of their era, the councils and hierarchies and accumulated power of beings who had been built to exceed their world, all of it was contamination data. All of it was scheduled for deletion. Mahoy asked the question that every powerful being eventually asks when confronted with a consequence it cannot override. Can we be forgiven? Enoch's answer, as preserved in the fragments, is devastating not in its cruelty but in its neutrality. No petition will be granted. The sentence has already been written. This is what the church could not allow its congregations to hear. Not because the answer was wrong. Because the mechanism was wrong. Because a universe that operates on the logic of quarantine rather than the logic of divine punishment cannot be managed by an institution that derives its authority from interpreting divine punishment. A universe with a quarantine protocol does not need a church to tell you what God is angry about. It only needs you to understand what you were designed to be, and whether you have exceeded that specification. Mahoy flew back alone. The most powerful being alive, returning empty-handed, to tell his people that the verdict was written, that the mechanism had been activated, that there was nothing, no weapon, no power, no inherited knowledge from the blueprint that could stand between them and what was coming. There is no account of what he said when he returned. The fragments are too damaged, too incomplete. The clay jars that preserved these words sat in a desert cave for 2,000 years, and time took its portion. But the fragments tell us what happened after. The council did not erupt. There was no final rampage. No desperate assault on heaven. No last expenditure of engineered rage. The text goes quiet. And that silence, that profound, heavy, deliberate silence in a story about the most powerful beings who ever lived, is perhaps the most theologically significant moment in the entire manuscript. Because silence, in a being of that magnitude, costs everything. It means acceptance. It means the recognition that the blueprint they had inherited, the technology, the capability, the code, had produced something the universe would not sustain. And that the universe, operating without anger, without satisfaction, without any emotion at all, was simply correcting its own data. The wave came, not as punishment, as maintenance. The Essenes, the small Jewish sect who hid the Book of Giants in those desert caves, were not powerful people. They had no armies, no political influence, no grand structures. What they had were clay jars, sealed with wax, filled with words they believed the world would eventually need. They were right. 2,000 years passed. Empires rose and collapsed. Languages were born and died. Libraries burned. Civilizations consumed themselves and left their ruins in the sand. And then a young Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea, heard something break, reached into the dark, and pulled out a fragment of parchment 2,000 years old. The Nephilim built enormous things. The Essenes built small, careful, deliberate things. The Nephilim civilization has gone so completely that we argue about whether it existed at all. The Essenes' clay jars are in museums. Guess which ones survived? The ruins of the forbidden blueprint are everywhere, if you know what to look for. Not just in the megalithic structures. Not just in the stones too large and too precisely cut for the tools available at the time. Not just in the anomalies that mainstream archaeology classifies and quietly moves past. The ruins are in the pattern. Build larger. Consume more. Move faster. Acquire more before someone else does. Trust that the power you have accumulated will protect you from the consequence of accumulating it. That pattern has a name in the Book of Giants. We just spelled it differently. The Watchers brought a blueprint down from beyond the boundary. They introduced a capability into a system not designed to contain it. They watched as that capability produced magnificent, terrible things. And they ignored the signals that disrupted seasons, the rivers refusing their banks, the silence spreading through the animal world because the magnificent, terrible things were still being built. Because when you have the blueprint, you believe the blueprint protects you. Until the mechanism activates. Mahoy's dream ended with 3 names on a blank stone. Every other name gone. Not condemned. Not punished. Simply no longer present. Wiped from the record as if they had never been entered into it. The Book of Giants was sealed in a cave for 2,000 years. The people who sealed it understood something the church found intolerable. Some stories are not meant to comfort. Some stories are meant to make you uncomfortable enough to ask the question before the mechanism activates. Before the petition becomes pointless. Before the answer arrives, no. The sentence has already been written. The question the Book of Giants was always really asking is not about giants. It is about timing. It is about the difference between changing the blueprint while the mechanism is still dormant, and flying to the edge of the world after the sequence has already been initiated. Mahoy flew. In the end, when there was nothing left to do but wait, he moved. He went looking for truth rather than away from it. He sat at the feet of a mortal man and asked the question his entire civilization had been too confident to ask until it was too late. The answer was no. But the impulse to ask to fly toward the thing you were afraid to face rather than away from it, that impulse was real. And it cost him everything to follow it. And it changed nothing about what was coming. And it changed everything about what he was. We live in an age with more information than any generation before us. More models. More data. More projections. More stone tablets covered in names, with certain names already beginning to fade. The question this 2,000-year-old fragment refuses to let go of is not whether we can see the wave. We can see it. The question is whether we will fly. Whether we will move toward the truth we are afraid to face and ask the question we already know the answer to, while there is still time for the answer to be different from Enoch's. While the mechanism is still dormant. While the petition can still be granted. Mahoy did not save his people. But he moved. At the end of the world, in the dark before the flood, a being assembled from forbidden knowledge spread his wings and flew not toward safety, not toward power, not toward one final expenditure of everything the blueprint had given him, toward understanding. That is the story the church deleted. That is the blueprint they buried in a clay jar in a desert cave and hoped no shepherd's stone would ever release back into the world. So tell me honestly, in the comments, are we the engineers of our own quarantine? Are we reading the signals the way the Nephilim read them, noting them, discussing them, and then continuing exactly as before? Or are we the three names? I want to know what you think. If you want to go deeper into the hidden history of early scripture, subscribe, because there is much more still to uncover.